Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Lamed begins the fourth parak of the Masechta, the fourth chapter, and it contains two Mishnayos. Begins with a Mishnah and is neatly divided in half by a second Mishnah. The first Mishnah discusses the halacha that Chazal said that you shouldn't do certain activities which appear to be weekday work. You shouldn't do them regularly. You should do them with a shino. You should do them differently somehow so that it's indicated that this is Yom Tov, and although you're allowed to do these activities, you're not doing regular weekday work. The Mishnah will end off with a discussion of opening new storehouses. When do we consider things that are put away in a storehouse to be muktzah? Second Mishnah will discuss the topic of taking wood from a structure. When do we have a problem of soser, of destroying the structure, and when do we have a problem that wood is muktzah, set aside. We'll get into a little of the halacha of sukkah, when the wood, schach, or the decorations of a sukkah are considered muktzah. So let's begin. The Mishnah says somebody wants to move wine bottles from one place to another, should not move a whole bunch at a time in a box. You shouldn't even put one in a box, the Hashem say. Should not move them in a box, because that looks like he's transporting merchandise from place to place. Even though there's no isser of malacha here, there is no isser of tchum, because he's either within the tchum or he has an eir of tchumin. But it should be clear that it's not a weekday activity, and therefore he should only carry one bottle at a time. He could carry it on his shoulder, or he could carry it in his hands in front of him. Either way is okay, but it shouldn't be moving large amounts at a time. Somebody wants to move straw, should put it in a box slung over should not put it in a box slung over the back. He should carry it in his hands. Now, as far as accessing new things from a storehouse, so the Mishnah brings what appears to be two contradictory halachas. Somebody wants to take straw from a pile of straw that he's not started using yet. So mentally, that would seem to be set aside to be a muktzah because he did not think of it as useful straw yet. But he wants to take straw from it to use for firewood. So he's allowed to take that straw. This would seem to indicate that there's no problem of muktzah. But then the next halacha in the Mishnah is he cannot take wood from his backyard, and the implication would be that is muktzah. The Gemara will discuss how these two halachas go together. So first of all, let's see the Gemara on the first part of the Mishnah. The Gemara says that you should always do a shinoi, but if you cannot do a shinoi in these activities that appear to be weekday, you are allowed to do it the regular way. Chazal did not forbid you from doing it; they just wanted you to do a shinoi if possible. The Gemara says that in the town of Mechuzah, where Rava was the Rav, he set up the following system of carrying a bale of hay from one place to another. He said that the best way to do it is you should really carry it on your shoulder. If you cannot carry it on your shoulder, so then you can carry it in a pitchfork. Can't carry it in a pitchfork, you can carry it on a stick held between two people on their shoulders. If you can't do that, then another solution would be in your hands. Again, the function of all of these is we want you to do it differently than usual. We would like you to make it lighter, easier than usual. Most of these are easier than we want you to do it in an easy way. If you can, then we just want you to do it in some way that's different than the usual way. And therefore, if you can't do any of those, you should cover it with a cloth as you're carrying it. Again, that's a sign that this is something special here. This is not a regular weekday activity. If you don't have a cloth to cover with and you can't do any of these other solutions, then you can just carry it in the normal way because you do not have to do a shino if you cannot. Now the Gemara brings two incidents about questions concerning shino. The Gemara says Rav Chanan bar Rava said to Rav Ashi that the Rabbanan say that you're supposed to do a shino as much as you can, yet the women who draw water don't do it with a shino. Why don't we protest? So he said, because there's no solution, there is no shina that they could do. Those who draw in a large bucket of water and they have to make very few trips, you can't tell them to draw it in smaller buckets and do more trips, because although you're saving less effort in the drawing, they have to do more trips, and therefore it's more effort that way, so you didn't solve anything. Those who do the opposite, you have the opposite problem. If they make a lot of trips in small buckets, don't tell them to use a large bucket, because again, you'll just make them have to do more work in the drawing, although less trips. So what do you want them to do? Cover with a lid. Sometimes the lid will fall off, and then you have a bigger problem. They're going to carry it. So you want them to tie the lid on with a string. The string will break, and they'll end up tying a knot. That's an Issa D'Oraisa. We don't want them to do that. So you want them to cover it with a cloth, which won't fall off. You know what's going to happen? It's going to get soaked in the water, and they're going to end up squeezing it out. So there's too many problems here. Better just leave it the way it is. Okay, another similar story is that Rav bar Rav Chanin asked Abaye. We know that the halacha is you're not allowed to clap, you're not allowed to slap your hand on your leg, and you're not allowed to dance on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, but we see that people are doing it, and we don't protest against them. How come we don't protest? Similar kind of thing. So he said, we don't protest we do not protest against people. We don't stop them from doing things where they're not going to listen to us. We have a rule, mutav shu shogig in value mizidin. Better off they do it by accident without knowing that it's forbidden than they do it on purpose after we told them that it's forbidden, and now there's no excuse for them. We'd rather they have an excuse than we tell them and get rid of their excuse. And a similar situation is there's a lechi. You're not supposed to sit at the entrance to a mavoi. That's an alley where there's a lechi. And you're allowed to carry within the mavoi, but you're not allowed to carry outside the mavoi in Rosh Hashanah. If you sit at the entrance, you won't see the lechids near you. And what happens is if something will drop from your hands and roll into Rosh Hashanah, you'll go pick it up, and that'll literally be carrying from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. So you're not supposed to sit there. However, people do that. And again, we don't protest against them, and the reason must be, like I told you, because they're not going to listen to us anyway, so we would rather they be shogigin, they be doing it unknowingly than they be doing it mezidin. Now he said that we only say that concept on an Isser D'Rabbanan, when the Rabbanan said not to do something and people aren't going to listen anyway, so we don't bother enforcing it. But he said on a D'Oraisa we wouldn't do that. The Gemara says differently. The Gemara says even on a D'Oraisa we would not enforce that. Certain D'Oraisas, again, if they're not going to listen to us, such as Min HaTorah, you're supposed to start fasting before Yom Kippur begins. It says B'tisha L'chodesh, you're supposed to start fasting somewhat before Yom Kippur itself, a few minutes. People don't do that; they eat all the way up to the deadline. But we don't enforce that because, again, they're not going to listen to us anyway. Okay, now the Gemara refers to the next part of the Mishnah, where we said you're allowed to take straw from the straw pile, but you're not allowed to take wood from the backyard. So the Gemara says, why not? The Gemara asks this contradiction two ways. Is this Reb Shimon who doesn't hold of muktzah? If it's Reb Shimon who doesn't hold of a muktzah, you're allowed to repurpose things. So then why are you not allowed to take the wood? And if it's Reb Yehuda who holds that who holds that there is muktzah and you're not allowed to repurpose things, why does he hold that you are allowed to take the straw? So the Gemara says, either I'll tell you that it's Reb Shimon, and he agrees that the wood is muktzah because this is referring to wood that's expensive wood set aside as lumber for building, not for burning, such as the cedar beams. Or I'll tell you that it's Reb Yehuda, and this straw is not muktzah because it's low quality straw that you couldn't possibly use for anything else, and therefore it has to be used for firewood. And the problem with the straw is that it's moldy, it's rotten. So Gemara says, why are you telling me that's not useful for other things? It is useful for other things. It's useful for making cement. You mix it into cement. So Gemara says, because it's thorns. There's thorns in the straw, and you can't mix it because you're going to scratch up your hand. Okay, that concludes the Gemara's comments on the Mishnah. We get to our next Mishnah, which discusses taking wood from a structure. So the Mishnah says you're not allowed to take wood from a structure. You can only take wood from near the structure. Now, the structure, the Gemara calls it a sukkah, but Rashi explains we're not talking about the sukkah of sukkis, the sukkah of mitzvah. We're talking about a sukkah, just a hut that people sat in on a different Yom Tov, on Shavuos or on Pesach. And when we say that you're not allowed to take straw from the sukkah, we mean, Gemara's initial understanding is you're not allowed to take straw from the, it doesn't say straw, it says wood. You're not allowed to take branches from the schach, from the top. Now, the Gemara says you can't take from the structure itself, but you can take from what's close to it. The Gemara doesn't understand what's the difference. The assumption is that the structure itself is the wood which is forming the roof. What's close to it means other wood that's piled on top of that. So the Gemara says, but whatever's piled on top is all batel to the ceiling. It's batel to the main sukkah. It's part of the structure. Even though you don't necessarily need it, you could get rid of it and you would still have a standing sukkah, but it's still part of it, and therefore when you're taking it off, you're still taking something from the structure, and you're still violating the issur of destroying, the issur of seiser. So you shouldn't be allowed to do that. So the Gemara gives two answers. The main idea of both answers is that we're talking about the wood that's there is not batel to the structure. It's set aside and it's different somehow. So the Gemara gives one answer is that we're not referring to the ceiling, the schach on the ceiling, we're referring to the walls. The walls, what's part of the structure is woven together. This is referring to other things that are just standing there, they're not woven together, therefore it's not part of the structure, and therefore there's no problem of seiser, it's not destroying the walls. The other answer is that it is referring to the ceiling, the schach, and there you can't tell me that the schach is woven because the schach is not woven, the reeds are all just put up there, and therefore any additional weeds are in the same state as the reeds are the actual ceiling. Therefore, there's no difference. But what you could tell me is that these reeds that you're allowed to take off are still bundled up. They're still wrapped in a rope. They haven't been untied. They've just been thrown up there, and therefore they're not part of the structure, and therefore they're allowed to take them off, and it's not considered to be breaking the structure at all. Okay, now the Gemara brings a similar brisa. Yosef brought the brisa. He said in front of Yechanan, you're not allowed to take wood from a sukkah. You have to take from near the sukkah. But here, Reb Shimon says that it is permitted. You are allowed to take wood from the sukkah. And both the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon agree that on sukkahs it's usher unless you made a tanai, unless you made a condition that when I built it, it's not part of my sukkah, and I'm allowed to. When I built it, you didn't. You said that I'm allowing myself to take this wood away whenever I need to. The Gemara will discuss exactly how the Tanai works. First, the Gemara wants to know what is this machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon? If you're destroying the sukkah, you're destroying the sukkah. How could they argue about it? If it's referring to the type of wood which is part of the sukkah, you can't take it off. If it's not part of the wood, if it's not part of the sukkah, so then you could. What's going on? So the Gemara says we're talking about a case where the sukkah collapsed already, and therefore you're not destroying any structure. Machlokes is about muktzah. According to the Tanna Kama, since it was part of the sukkah, it was on the sukkah, it's muktzah. According to Reb Shimon, it's not part of the sukkah, and therefore, even if it was part of the sukkah, it's not muktzah because you could have removed it all along. Now, the Gemara says this is very similar to another statement of Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says you're allowed to use oil or a candle left over from a candle after it goes out. While a candle is burning, you can't use it because it's muktzah machmas iser. You could cause the candle to be extinguished if you try to take some of it. Also, it's set aside for the candle. It's also potentially mias. So you can use it. However, once a candle goes out, Reb Shimon says you're allowed to use what's left over. And the Tanna Kama says you're not. Again, Reb Shimon's understanding is that just because it was muktzah in the beginning doesn't mean that it's muktzah now. You had in mind all along you were going to use it when the candle goes out. The same thing would be here. You had in mind you were planning to use the wood of the sukkah when it collapses. And the Tanna Kama, though, would say that no, you cannot use the candle when it goes out. That's part of the candle. It's forbidden, therefore you can't use it. And you also cannot use the wood of the sukkah when it collapses. So the Gemara says that there's a difference. How could you say that Rav Shimon would say just because you could use the wax or the oil of the candle when it goes out, you're therefore allowed to use the wood of the sukkah when it collapses? People know a candle is going to go out at some point, and they intend to use the wax, the cup, the oil, whatever is left over. They have that in mind, because they know it's going to go. But you didn't know your sukkah is going to collapse. You don't sit there saying, when my sukkah collapses, then I'm going to use the wood. You didn't expect it to collapse. So Gemara says, no, we're talking about a weak sukkah where it was not structurally sound, and pretty much you knew it was going to collapse, and you expected it to collapse, therefore that's not a problem. Okay, now the Gemara refers to the sukkah of sukkahs. We had said that everybody agrees that that's aser, because it's all part of the sukkah. It has a special chashivas. So it's considered to be part of the sukkah. It's set aside. You can't use it for other things. It's the sukkah of the mitzvah. So Gemara is surprised, though, that we said that a t'nai works. If the guy says from the beginning that I intend to use this, then it's okay. The Gemara says, but it's not true. T'nai doesn't work on a sukkah. The Gemara says you can derive this from psukkah. We have a pasuk that says Chag HaSukkah Sheves Yamim LaHashem. So the Chag, which refers to the Korban Chagiga, is all 7 days is LaHashem, is for Hashem. So the Sukkah itself is also all 7 days LaHashem. The Chag and the Sukkah are together. Chag HaSukkah Sheves Yamim LaHashem. Just like the Korban Chagiga is LaHashem, the Sukkah is all 7 days LaHashem. That means that the Sukkah is set aside for the mitzvah. You can't use it for anything else. So what's going on over here? How could we say that a Tanai works? So the Gemara says this line is not going back on the Sukkah Sachag. Not going back on the Sukkah of Sukkahs. It's going back on the first line in the Mishnah, which was the first line in the Brisa, which was referring to a regular hut. There, you are allowed to make it Tanai. But you're right. The Sukkah itself, the Sukkah of Yom Tov, you would not be allowed to use it at any point, and a Tanai would not help. You cannot say, I plan to use it at some point during Sukkahs. It's set aside for the mitzvah, it has Kedusha. Can't use it at any point during Sukkahs. Now the Gemara challenges that. The Gemara says, is that true? The Gemara says, it would seem to be not true, because we have a brisa that talks about the decorations of the sukkah, and it says somebody who built a sukkah, set it up correctly, and he put on the decorations. He put on sheets, colored cloths with all kinds of drawings and images on it, or he hung walnuts, or almonds, or peaches, or pomegranates, grapes, wine bottles, oil bottles, flour, all these things. He hung them in the sukkah as a decoration. He's not allowed to eat from them and not allowed to use them on Yom Tov all 7 days until the last day of Yom Tov is over. He's not allowed to use them, but if he made it Tanai, then it's okay. So you see that Tanai works. So why are you telling me from Sugim that the Tanai doesn't work on a Sukkah? So Gemara says it's two different things. Gemara says Abai and Rava answer, this is talking about the decorations of the Sukkah. And somebody could say on the decorations of the Sukkah, in the entire Bein Hashmashos, in the beginning of Yom Tov, he could say, this is not part of my Sukkah. I have rights to use this. I'm leaving it here for now, but it's not part of my Sukkah. I still have rights to use it. But the Sukkah itself is part of the mitzvah. It's the mitzvah of Sukkah. You cannot take the mitzvah apart and say it's not part of the mitzvah. I'm keeping it for myself. You're making it part of the Sukkah. The decorations, you could say, I'm putting it here, but I'm not letting it become restricted to the rules of the Sukkah. I'm still maintaining access to it. But the sukkah itself is the mitzvah. In the beginning of sukkah, it has to be for the mitzvah. You can't say that, and therefore it becomes forbidden. So now the Gemara says, what is this different than a case of somebody who has an esrog? Somebody has, let's say, 7 esrogim, and he says, I'm going to use a different esrog for each day of Yom Tov. So each esrog becomes permitted as soon as he uses it. Now, the machlokes if it becomes permitted right away when he uses it, or at the end of the day that he used it. But either way, he's allowed to eat it at some point. It's not forbidden for all 7 days. So how come here the sukkah say it's forbidden for all 7 days? Let it be forbidden for the first day, and then afterwards, he could insist that he wants to use it afterwards. Just like the esrog has a right to say that he only wants the esrog to be a mitzvah esrog for 1 day, and then he could eat it afterwards. And that's referring to where he had another esrog. So the sukkah should be able to say it's only a mitzvah for 1 day, and then afterwards I want it. So the Gemara says there's a difference. The lulav and esrog is considered to be 7 separate mitzvahs. Each day is a different mitzvah, and therefore once a mitzvah is over, it's over, the esrog's kedusha is over, and you could use it for your own things if you intend to. Of course, if you want it to stay for the next days, you can, but you can use it for your own things now. And the reason that it's 7 separate mitzvahs is because there's no mitzvah of lulav and esrog at night. The night there, you cannot do the mitzvah at night, and therefore it's broken up. The next day is a new mitzvah. However, sukkah is a mitzvah during the day and the night, therefore it's one continuous 7-day long mitzvah, and there is no breaking up. And if it's the sukkah of the mitzvah in the beginning, it stays the sukkah of a mitzvah all the way through till the end of sukkah.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.